You're listening to the OCD Stories podcast, hosted by me, Stuart Ralph. The OCD Stories is a podcast dedicated to raising awareness and understanding around obsessive-compulsive symptoms. I do this through interviewing inspired therapists, psychologists, and people who have experienced OCD. Welcome to the OCD Stories. And welcome to episode 497 of the podcast. And in this one, I got on Dr. Steven Phillipson. Steven is a many-time guest. He is a licensed clinical psychologist who specialises in CBT for OCD. And in this episode, we discuss identity contamination as a theme of OCD, the amygdala, not buying into OCD themes, talking about OCD with people, Dr. Phillipson's cancelled Toku list, a list of irrational or maladaptive words and concepts and their more adaptive equivalents, some ERP tools, and much more. And if you're a therapist listening to this, the centre I co-founded, we are running a live training with Dr. Phillipson in September. It's rare that he does a training outside of his own centre, so it's great to host him. So if you're a therapist listening to this and interested, I'll put a link in the show notes. And thanks to our podcast partners, NoCD. If OCD is interfering with your life, NoCD can help. Their licensed therapists specialise in exposure and response prevention therapy, the most proven therapy for OCD. With NoCD, effective treatment that is 100% virtual is available for children and adults with OCD. And most members can get started within 7 days on average. No hassle, just real science-backed help and support between sessions. Begin your journey at nocd.com, or I'll put the link in the episode description. So thank you to Dr. Phillipson for his time and expertise. It's always a pleasure to talk with him. And thank you to you guys for listening. It means a lot, especially as we approach episode 500. So without further ado, here is Dr. Phillipson. Welcome back to the podcast, Steve.
Always a pleasure. And looking forward to once again sharing ideas with my favorite podcaster.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So I was actually looking back for another episode I was doing, reviewing the podcast a little bit. And I noticed our first episode was 99, I believe. So, almost at 500 now. So it's 400 episodes ago. That's 8 years ago.
Yeah, and I think this is my number 20 podcast with you. So a wonderful celebration of 20.
That's awesome. Nice. I knew it was a lot. I didn't know it was 20. That's cool. We're going to cover various topics today. The first one being just another theme. So I think it was the last episode we covered lots of different themes or smaller themes of OCD that maybe aren't as common. Identity contamination. What do you want to say about that? What is it?
So it's not a very common form of OCD, but I've seen it in 30 years, perhaps 4 or 5 times. So you can appreciate how rare this one is. Basically, it's sort of a combination of contamination OCD along with character indictment, but by proxy, meaning the character indictment is of another person in the OCD sufferer's life. And this person can be a family member or a friend. And the idea is that the targeted person has significant character flaws or is seen by the patient as being typically a loser, as in a person with very poor social skills, or is seen by the patient in a very negative light. And the idea is that whether the targeted person, whether touching that person or even touching objects that person possesses, can actually be imbued into the patient's identity. And so it's sort of a very, very unusual theme, the idea that if there's someone that I see as being very negative or very low status, that if I come in contact with them or their objects, can take on the characteristics of this undesirable person. And so there is often a lot of either cleaning involved in terms of getting rid of the loser particles or poor identity particles. Um, or there might also be just kind of mental rituals to assure that I'm not now acting in some new identity way. And so I just thought I would mention it because it is a subset of OCD, and yet once again, it's kind of rarely mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've definitely come across it before.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, with this sort of teenage range. So with this theme for you, how are you working with it from like an ERP perspective? Are you getting
I
them to
mean,
spend more time
basically,
around these people or?
yeah, very, very similar to how I would do ERP with anyone with contamination OCD, only obviously combining not only the behavioral aspect of having the patient kind of come in contact with objects or, touching the identified loser, but also, kind of embracing, kind of showing their brain that they're embracing the concept that they're willing to absorb the loser nature of their target. And so, I would say that, it is sort of just a kind of standard form of exposure with contamination, with the caveat of there being a kind of a cognitive threatening component to it. So it's sort of a combination of contamination with a puro cognition element to it.
Interesting, interesting. So yeah, so you've only come across this sort of 4 or 5 times in your career.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But I mean, it certainly is always endlessly amusing that the human brain can generate such a say unique or unusual association. It really just goes to show how, with OCD, the topics that the brain selects through its own sort of emotional biochemical imbalance, are so, highly irrational, sometimes bizarre, and unlikely. And yet, because the biochemical emotional reaction is so authentic, very, very rational, intelligent people act in very desperate and irrational, unintelligent ways to assuage the emotional component. And, I can't say often enough, how important it is to really not delve into the actual themes of OCD. Because when you unplug the imbalanced emotional component, the person becomes like any other, kind of rational human that would recognize the irrelevance, or I would even say stupidity, of the themes. And I always emphasize that, hey, your brain's theme is really stupid, but obviously you're not. It's just our brains can generate very, very unintelligent concepts and make them feel so authentic. And so, I mean, I'm not sure about in your caseload, but I hear, at least 5 times a day, oh, it feels so real.
Hmm.
And therefore, the person becomes so persuaded by the emotional component to become, emotionally and behaviorally activated, by these highly irrational concepts.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not the smart part of their brain that's buying into this, and that's why it feels
Yeah.
real. Yeah.
Yeah, I like when people refer to it as the reptilian part of our brain because the amygdala obviously has no rational or language component or intelligence component to it. It's just a malfunctioning crisis signal.
Hmm.
And when we feel like I say when we're on the top floor of a burning building and we feel the desperation of extricating ourselves from the crisis, people will behave in very desperate ways in order to calm down that malfunctioning system. And obviously, when one engages in ritualizing of avoidance or escape, it activates the brain's sense of legitimacy that the crisis is authentic, and unfortunately conditions the brain to think that more, warning signals are necessary.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I remember where I used to live, my burglar alarm, um, it went off, but that was because it started randomly beeping in the night and I didn't know how to an insignificant beep. It would have been annoying, but it wasn't, but it was enough that I was like, I need to fix this out. So I decided to unscrew it, not realizing that that would trip like an alarm because burglars obviously unscrew it. The whole alarm went off. And I knew I wasn't being burgled because it was me doing it, but my adrenaline was through the roof because the burglar alarm is the worst thing I've ever heard. It's which is meant to, right? Because it's meant to scare the person and get them. But I guess what I'm saying is logically, I knew I was fine, but it didn't stop my anxiety from being through the roof. And it's similar to that in OCD.
Yeah, I'll share something pretty funny. My house has also a burglar alarm system, and somehow the gods of annoyance were aligned against me because every time I would go on vacation, the burglar alarm would go off at 3 in the morning. I would get a call from the police. I'd get a call from the neighbors, and I'd be completely helpless other than, telling them that it's a false alarm.
Mm.
Maybe the wind blew off the connections, but it happened probably 10 times on 10 different vacations, and it was always when I was away. So I can appreciate your story.
Yeah, they're useful, but they can be frustrating. Um, okay, so let's talking about OCD with co-workers, with general public, anyone you feel you need to tell. Um, what things are you telling your clients to keep in mind, or how to communicate it, or anything you want to say on it?
When I think about this topic, it always reminds me of the first time that I was introduced to OCD. At the time, I might have mentioned I was on track to become an eating disorder specialist. I had done a thesis on anorexia. I had done a thesis and my doctoral dissertation on bulimia. And while I was in my third year in graduate school, a woman came in front of the entire class. She was very well dressed. She was 35, sounded very intelligent. And she talked to our class about driving to work, and her brain would tell her that she might have hit someone on the way to work. And then she would drive around her block a number of times looking for bodies. She would finally go to work, and the first thing she would do is she would call the police, she'd call the hospitals, and she'd call the ambulance services to see if any hit and run incidents occurred, because she couldn't figure out whether she had hit someone on her way to work. And I'm looking at her, and I'd already met with people with schizophrenia, who had a detachment from reality testing. And here it seemed like she had a detachment from reality testing because she wasn't aware that she might have hit someone on her way to work. That sounds crazy. And yet there was nothing else about her that looked or sounded in any way like the psychotic patients that I had had history working with. And I was very bewildered by her presentation, and I had no experience with OCD at that point in my career. And I thought to myself, oh my God, I'm so glad I work with eating disordered women because that sounds really crazy. And I would have no clue how to work with that. And so that always reminds me of how bizarre this topic must be to lay people who don't have OCD. And unfortunately, tragically, many mental health professionals who are not adequately trained to identify and or treat OCD. And so it brings up a very important question in terms of disclosure, talking to friends about it, talking to family members, and I think, or even coworkers. And I tell my patients across the board to never bring up their OCD to within a professional environment, because I've had a few patients who've not heeded that concept, and in bringing it up to coworkers, I've had a few patients be actually prejudiced against, missed promotions, and basically every little quirky thing that they do be asked, "Oh, is that your OCD?" And so creating this kind of a ghost of uncertainty within coworkers, I think has had and has the potential to really be detrimental to people's potential career. So across the board, I always recommend not to bring that kind of personal information into the workforce. In terms of disclosing it to a loved one, a number of my patients will be dating a new person, and they'll ask, at what point might I bring it up to my girlfriend? And I'll basically say, you might want to have them first read like an article like Rethinking the Unthinkable or What is OCD, um, so that the person has somewhat of a preliminary background in understanding the nature of how our human brain can kind of go off the rails in terms of its rational thinking. And yet it's not a representation of a person being, kind of irrationally crazy. So generally, I will recommend that if a person is in treatment, that they might come in for a session in which I can explain to the person the nature of how natural it is for us, our human brains, to create these very creative associations. But with OCD, these natural associations like, jumping off of a cliff or harming a loved one, um, you know, uh, can, once infused with a distress signal, creates a very strong alarm that sort of demands resolution rather than it just being a very natural human association that comes up. So the themes that are most likely, I think, to produce misunderstandings, probably first and foremost would be, HOCD, people who spike about being gay, and whether with therapists who are uneducated about OCD or loved ones or friends, most often people will hear responses like, "Hey, it's okay if you're gay. I'll love you anyway." And really, the people that they share it with are most often likely to convey, a sense of acceptance that being gay is okay, rather than really kind of understanding that this has got nothing to do with the person being gay, but just once again a creative brains association. I think the second, if not even tie with number one, most misunderstood theme would be what I've referred to as ROCD or relationship OCD, where people, engage in a very deep dive questioning as to whether or not the person that they're with is adequate for them. Obviously, often this is associated with questions like, are my feelings for this person adequate or sufficient to be in this level of relationship? Is this person intelligent enough? Does this person have a good enough sense of humor? The questions around, whether or not someone is in an appropriate relationship are basically endless, and very much mimic often very common questions that anyone would have, let's say after the 2 to 3 month mark, where someone is considering getting a deep dive involvement in a intimate bond. But obviously with OCD, there often is a very kind of peculiar desperation and need to figure out and get an answer, rather than it just being a more natural sort of uncertainty. And that really is what distinguishes, the kind of ROCD from someone who's just kind of having more natural concerns. And often you'll see that people's concerns revolve around sometimes very meaningless entities, like person's eyebrows are bushier. I've had people, after being in a relationship for 4 years, start questioning Hey, is he tall enough for me? Maybe I should be with a taller person. And, after 4 years of being in a relationship, you really, that ship has sort of sailed.
Mm.
That question is no longer really a meaningful entity in, kind of figuring out whether you're with the appropriate person or not. So, I would say that's sort of number one or tied for number two. Obviously, a very, very probably the most shameful spike is the POCD or people who spike about being a pedophile. I think that it's so easily misunderstood, and the idea of sharing, maybe I'm attracted to younger children, or maybe I'm not safe around younger children. It would be a very, very cautious topic to disclose to someone who is not a well-informed professional, because, obviously someone misconstruing the nature of this could be very, very problematic for that person's sense of identity. I've had tragically a number of patients who've mentioned to their pediatrician, that they've had thoughts of harming their child, whether it be physically or sexually, and instances where the pediatrician, acting based on their responsibility as a professional to report a risk, not really being educated enough to do an adequate kind of investigation as to OCD, and where parents have had their children removed because of these misunderstandings. Obviously that's also, a very commonly misunderstood topic. Do you have any topics that you would also kind of share under that umbrella of most often misconstrued?
Sort of, I can't remember if you said it, but like racist OCD, you could call it. So I'm afraid I'm going to say some racial slur, or I am a racist, or whatever it is. Obviously, sharing that in a workplace might get some frowns. And what else? I'm not too sure. I think on the whole work thing, because I think sometimes some people do need adjustments at work. Maybe they can't be in the office 5 days. Maybe they need to work from home 2 days because of their anxiety, whatever it is. There, surely you can just share, you can just say, I have an anxiety disorder as opposed to OCD. And even if you say OCD, you can just say, I just get anxious about things. You don't necessarily have to say, I'm worried about being a paedophile or the themes, because ultimately HR, it's none of their business anyway what your themes are. They just need to know that you get really anxious and can't do this or struggle with this, or,
No, I certainly agree. I think that, like I said, most people, even, within work or out of work, when they share that they have OCD, it's very common that people will look at any little thing that they do that looks a little bit quirky and say, "Oh, is that your OCD?" And so, it is very common to, have people really attribute any little thing to the OCD, and that can be very frustrating, before or for the OCD patient. So, is there anything else you wanted to add to that topic of OCD disclosure?
Only that, just maybe from a kid's perspective, because that's obviously largely who I work with. Usually it's quite beneficial for the schools to know, and usually they then put things in place, at least in England. And sometimes they don't even care because they're so busy they can't put anything in place anyway. So they but I think that could be useful. I've rarely seen that be negative, but sometimes I feel parents are worried about that with the school. But the schools, they don't care. They ultimately want the kids to get the best grades because it makes them look good. So if making adjustments for the OCD helps that kid excel academically, they're all for it usually. But again, with any of this, I think also adding in common sense. Can you see your school or workplace do they have a track record of treating other people with mental health with decency and care? And if they do, then maybe that's a safe place to open up. But if you've seen no one never comes forward, or there might be a reason for that, you know.
No, I certainly agree.
Cool. So, let's think about, okay, so you sent over the cancelled Toku list. So,
Toku.
Toku,
Yes.
sorry. Firstly, what is it? And then why that name? Because the name, as we discussed earlier, doesn't really link to the list.
Well, the name is sort of meaningless. It's actually just a local restaurant, and I had started a list of to do, and so canceling my reservations at Toku was part of that. And then I started writing down words that are representation of what is considered in cognitive behavioral therapy to be, kind of irrational, dysfunctional, or maladaptive words, but more concepts. Each word represents a concept that can be fairly detrimental to a person's welfare. And so this is not really pertinent to OCD sufferers per se, but as humans and OCD sufferers, kind of engaging in many of the perspectives that exist in society, I think it's really important that people be aware of these concepts, and that they have an awareness of what the words are, what the principles are, and how those principles can be substituted for much more rational, meaningful vocabulary.
Okay, so I've got the list in front of me. A couple that instantly jump out at me is the first one is want. And you've put there an over-identification with a craving or impulse. So like, oh, I want this or whatever it is. And the sort of the correction you've put here is I notice the desire to, or I feel drawn to. So from like a ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy framework, what you're doing there with that correction of language feels very like you're getting them to name it, notice the process that's going on, and not being, as you say, over-identified with the craving or the want.
So want is potentially problematic because it often is not in line with our values. People with OCD do not want to engage in exposure therapy. People with OCD do not want to have intrusive thoughts, and people with OCD do not want to experience the distress of anxiety. But in order to recover, allowing or giving permission to the brain producing intrusive thoughts is really essential. So that's why, want, particularly for the OCD population, can be kind of a problematic concept because, rather than I don't want to have an intrusive thought, we can say that, our brains will naturally produce intrusive thoughts, and these are tolerable or manageable, and I can give permission to my brain to produce these thoughts, and therefore, by not engaging in a distressful attempt to escape the thought and or the experience, that's where the recovery perspective exists. So that's why want is potentially problematic. I mean, I always tell my patients, if I was going to give in for every meal to what I wanted, I would choose to eat pizza for every meal, and I would weigh 600 pounds. So in that regard, want is not necessarily the most facilitating, word in our vocabulary.
Yeah. Okay. Nice. So where's that list gone? So there you might say, yeah, I noticed the desire to eat pizza again tonight, or I feel drawn to eating that pizza again.
Yes, as opposed to my values are to eat more healthy food and to maintain a healthy kind of body and cardiovascular system. And so, broccoli is less wanted, but more in line with my values.
Hmm. You could have a broccoli pizza, and then you're kind of, you know.
Don't tempt me, Stu. You're
Yeah.
very evil. Don't tempt me.
Yeah. I think I had a pizza once that was made with like a cauliflower base. I think it was a pizza. It wasn't that great, but it felt like a good compromise.
Right.
Not that I think there's anything wrong with pizza, but yeah, your point is if it's every day. So the next one that jumps out at me is fact. And then the
Yeah.
next word you put next to that. And I feel this links to OCD, like certainty. So if it's a fact, I have certainty. And then the kind of adjustment you've put there is, one perspective is,
Yeah.
or reported experience is,
Right.
more
So we could talk
balanced.
about the very controversial word fact through both a philosophical perspective or even an OCD perspective. So from OCD, one would say like facts, and there's also a word in the list, answers. People with OCD are desperate to achieve answers. Did I harm my child? Am I gay? Am I a pedophile? Can I catch AIDS from that doorknob? And unfortunately, as hopefully we've gone over a billion times, answers will never put out the flames of OCD's fires, because OCD is not based on a rational, need for an answer. OCD is based on an emotional system that is malfunctioning, and it creates an illusion that all you need to do is get some answers here, and you will be relieved of the distress. And obviously, nothing is further from the truth. So I'm always encouraging patients to abandon any efforts to achieve, a sense of like a fact. Can you get AIDS from a doorknob? A fact, is there a God?
Mm.
So I would say facts or answers or truth, they all kind of circulate, very much in the same sphere of, the idea of answer seeking, and the idea that, oh, if I can just nail down the truth about whether I harmed the child or any theme of OCD, can I catch my sister's loser personality by coming in contact with her or any of her items? By abandoning that quest, you really liberate yourself from the endless ritualizing of OCD.
Yeah, I like that. And just realize for anyone, well, most people are listening and not watching the podcast. Every time you use the word loser today, you've done it in speech marks or your fingers, just because if people can't see that. And then, so one other thing from the list, where's it gone? Not that one. We done that one. Let's do control. So influence of illusion. Sorry, of total influence.
Right. So many people with OCD tragically feel like they should be able to control their thoughts or be able to control their emotions. And then we've also spoken about people who, believe that they should be in control of sleep onset. And so it's really important to understand that, particularly with OCD, that our thoughts, as we've discussed, are an independent system, and that, I can choose right now to talk to you about sailing, or I can choose to talk to you about, British football, which we call soccer. We can choose to talk about many different topics, but in the meantime, I can't stop my brain from telling me to shoot my little doggy here. And so it'd be really important for me to understand that the thought of shooting little Harper, is completely out of control and not a representation of some personality flaw on my part. So, relinquishing control, accepting that our emotional system is out of control, our moods are often out of control. Sometimes they're related to our irrational thinking, but that's a whole nother story. Is a really, really important concept to relinquish control. and to look at, thoughts as something to manage and be both permission giving and accepting of, rather than, internalizing a sense of responsibility.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So we're leaving the Toku list. What am I saying?
Toku,
Toku.
cancel Toku.
Cancel Toku. So, and that restaurant did you cancel it because it was rubbish, or was it just you were busy, or?
Oh, it's one of my favorite restaurants. I just made a reservation at a different restaurant that a friend of mine had recommended, so
Okay,
I needed
cool.
to just transfer that.
Okay, cool. Good to clarify. And that's a New York restaurant, is it?
It's in Long Island. Yes,
Okay, cool.
highly recommend it.
All right. If you ever go, mention that Steve sent you.
They know me very well. I call it my second kitchen.
Okay. Nice. Okay, so that's last question. Looking from my list I wrote earlier. Yeah, so obviously we're doing well, via the center I co-run, we're doing a training with you specifically for therapists. And in that, you're going to talk about some of the ERP tools that you use. So I guess the question I had more generally is like among your kind of tailored interventions, like index cards, turning up the volume, spike hunts, these and more, which tends to surprise clients the most, or clients like the most, or I don't know. Yeah.
I'm not sure what you mean by surprise them. I wouldn't say that my patients are surprised when they hear about the
Yeah.
ERP tactics. I think for the most part, they understand them. One response that I get regularly, which is a wonderfully amusing and tragically misunderstanding of OCD treatment, when in terms of turning a person's intrusive thought topic into an exposure with an index card, having a person write down their intrusive thought topic like, um, oh, I thought about my grandmother who's deceased going to hell, and because I had that thought, maybe she will end up in hell and the friend of the devil. So you might write that down on an index card and then have a person expose themselves to it about 10 times a day. So a patient will say to me, I mean, my brain produces this thought 50 times a day. Why would I add to that by doing it on an index card? And the very educated answer is because when we turn an involuntary association, or what I call a spike, into a voluntary association or an exposure, we're showing the brain, we're demonstrating to the brain system that its signal is irrelevant. And as always, irrelevancy is the most basic formula for the treatment of OCD, to show the brain that its associations, its messages are insignificant and meaningless, and will not be given the effort to avoid or escape. So, when we engage in the exposure therapy with index cards, it's a very voluntary and very powerful demonstration of the acceptance of these topics.
Yeah, I like that. It always reminds me of in Harry Potter, Professor Dumbledore said to Harry, it's better to walk in the arena than be pushed in. And I like that from an ERP point of view. It's better to go after it than your
Yeah,
brain just give it to you.
right. I agree with that.
Yeah. I don't know if it's in the films, but it's in the books. I think the second to last book. Anyway, anything else you want to say about anything we talked about today?
So one of the most difficult and controversial concepts within cancel Toku, if we can revisit that for a minute, is referred to as emotional responsibility. And in emotional responsibility, a very, very difficult pill to swallow is the idea that, people always say, like, when you arrived late today, you made me mad, or, you made me disappointed. And in emotional responsibility, we don't attribute our feelings or emotional reactions to other people's behavior, but in a centered way, we accept it as our own response based on our own perspective. So an example that I always give is, Bob, after 4 years of dating Jane, Bob told Jane, hey, you know what? I'm ending this relationship. I've decided that this relationship no longer fulfills my emotional interests and values and priorities. And so I just wanted to let you know that you and I are done. So unfortunately, Jane goes and writes a note and jumps off a bridge and kills herself and says, hey, Bob, because you ended the relationship, I'll never have anyone else in my life to love. Therefore, life's not worth living. You made me suicidal. And so, one would say, okay, maybe Jane's sense of helplessness, caused that depressive response. And yet you could then say after 4 years, Bob broke up with Jane. And now Jane's internal response is, oh, thank goodness. I was going to do it anyway, but I was sort of hesitant and cautious. I'm so glad that he did this for me. And so now Jane is like, oh, I can go out and date someone that I find a lot more fulfilling. And so will we say, oh, Bob caused Jane's happiness? Where in the first example, Bob caused Jane's suicide. And so hopefully both of us can see quickly that Jane's response is based on Jane's internal perspective about Bob's behavior, and that Bob's behavior didn't actually, kind of create Jane's response, but Jane had to have an internal perspective in how she related to Bob's choices, and that produced Jane's response. And so this is a very, very difficult concept because we're very, very, kind of attuned to the idea of saying, oh, you made me mad when you did X, which is not really an assertive response, but to say that, when X happens, I respond with X emotional response. So that's another tough pill to swallow within the guidelines of what we call rational cognitive therapy.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of, just human relationships. Yeah, that example you gave of, oh, you did this. No, sorry. Yeah, you did this to me, when instead of actually it's, well, when you did that, I felt this way, which is more taking ownership over it versus you made me mad, not I had an emotional reaction when you did that certain thing.
Exactly.
I guess it's very relevant to couples therapy and stuff like that.
Comes up all the time.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Look, thank you so much for coming on again.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, great chatting with you. Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. And thank you to our Patreons who helped make this episode possible. And if you would like to find out more about Patreon and the rewards and benefits, then there will be a link in the episode description. If you enjoy the OCD Stories podcast and would like to support us, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to the podcast. And thank you to NoCD for supporting our work. If you want to find out more about NoCD, you can click the link in the episode description. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. And until we speak, take care.